we're finishing up the narrative part of the discussion. Advertisement and product placement is a huge part of the narrative. Trust me, it is much more impactful than you think it is, even if you don't buy the product, because the seed has been planted in your brain. Even if you're not, I don't drink cola, but the latest Coke commercial would indicate to me that if I did, I'd buy Coke. So advertising. Where else? We talked about school, government, church. What about family? What about family culture? Raise your hand if there is a story about your family going back generations. My great-great-great-great-granddaddy did this, and, the Trail of Tears, or, like the Civil Rights Movement. There's this story about family. The problem is you go back, you might even go back a couple of weeks and it might not be a true story. When you're talking about family history that no one was really there for and recorded it, it's basically what? Mythology. But it's a great story because it makes us proud of our family, and it helps the younger members of the family grow up like the rest of the family. Well, okay, that's great, especially if families are famous for their good deeds towards their fellow man and donating all kinds of stuff to charity. But if you come from a long line of bank robbers, maybe that's not so great. If you come from a long line of drug addicts and alcoholics and domestic violence people, well, there's your family story. But the story's so powerful, you might not give it up because it's still your story. And why is that? Because you believe it. Raise your hand if you are convinced that part of your drug and alcohol problem is the good old family tradition, like Hank said. I'm going to tell you something about stories. That story might be destroying your life, but it's still your story, and it's hard to give up. You might not be proud that your granddaddy drank himself to death and killed your grandmother in a drunk driving accident. She was ejected, but it's still the family story, and that's hard to lose. So what else? We got family, very important. And we're going to talk more about how the genetic or the epigenetic or the generational storyline impacts our lives. But this is just a general story about stories. What else we got? We had school, we had family, we had church and religion, we had government, entertainment, advertising.
I feel like the family narrative too can, not so much the family history, but just the way you grew up can encompass like all of those narratives in one, because they're all bringing what their ideologies from the narratives they're told into the house,
Yep. There's a fundamental personal narrative I think that every human being has, and it comes from either biology and evolution or theology, and it kind of supersedes all the stories. And the story is I got to survive no matter what. And that's the story that's inside your head. The problem with that, by the way, I want to tell you something right now, that one of the factors of the narrative is that it layers upon itself. And once that original story is laid down and then layer upon layer upon layer, good luck getting to the bottom of it to remove it. That's difficult. It's like sedimentary rock archaeology.
It's like that game you played in elementary school where you get in a circle and you tell somebody something in their ear, and by the time it gets all the way, by the time it gets all the way to the end,
mangled.
Well, that's a good point. That's how stories are distorted. That's a really good part. Yeah, a really good thing to bring up is that stories become distorted, and the original purpose sometimes is lost. And hence we have mythology. Most mythology is considered to be described as a set of stories that are trying to describe something. And by the time you get 5,000 years down the road, you've lost the original purpose. You look at monotheistic religion. If the leaders of those religions, like Jesus Christ and Muhammad and Buddha and all the other figures, were to be transported to the modern era, and they would see what has become of their religions, including Muhammad, who was warlike, but I don't think he would approve of the Taliban. I think it would be a totally different story. They'd be like, what's my story become? I mean, the story of Jesus Christ is the story is he died for the sins, right? And that's because he was compassionate and he was all forgiving, and he had tons of sympathy and compassion. he had a violent streak. He upset the moneylenders, right, at the temple. But that's because he couldn't stand what the moneylenders were doing. They were oppressing the poor. He was the original social justice warrior.
Exactly.
If he came to the modern era and saw abortion clinic bombers, he probably wouldn't approve. He'd be like, this is not what my story was intended for. So yes, stories change and they become subverted by mankind. The original storyline of I Gotta Survive is really interesting because that means I'll survive at any costs. And if I've got problems and I'm suffering and using drugs and alcohol seems to work and I can make it work, I'm going to do that because that's what I need to do to survive. And then someone comes along and says, you got to stop doing that. And you're going to be like, no, I don't, because I'm surviving and I'm holding on to that. That's part of the reason it's so hard to quit using drugs and alcohol is some part of your brain thinks you're real good at it. And why? Because I'm still living. Oh, if my life is so bad, why am I still living? And then someone might say, but it could be better. And you're like, no, because I've heard a whole bunch of stories that have told me that I'm never going to be good anyway. So just
look at me and be like, because of Narcan.
Well, right. So that original story of I got to survive no matter what kind of gets in the way because maladaptation kicks in and you start surviving but not thriving, and it takes a lot of motivation to change that. And here's the real deal. Why are we even talking about stories and narrative? Because they work. What's the most consistent, the average story, collective story from someone who comes into this group? Remember, we're talking about school, church, bullies, family.
We all have trauma.
Talking about trauma. What are those traumatic stories? What do we come away with? All right, you watch Disney, and if you live in the suburbs, no offense to the suburbs, and you have a wonderful family, and you watch Disney, you might come away from it feeling really good, and then that's going to set you up to get married and blah blah blah. But what's the average story for a trauma survivor living in poverty and in violence and domestic violence and abuse and neglect? The story, the belief that you have, especially as a kid, after reading the story is, I am less than. I am not good enough. I'm a bad person. And when you learn that as a little kid, it's really hard to unlearn it. Raise your hand if you just know that some institution or some family member or someone tried to convince you that you weren't good enough, that you were never going to amount to anything, that you were bad. Think you spill milk and you get whooped. That's the story that we're talking about here. If you want to know why it's so hard to be you, so to speak, and that it's just so hard, and it's so hard, why did I use drugs and alcohol to begin with, and why is it so hard to stop? Why am I on probation? A lot of it has to do with that original story that the purpose was to make you feel bad about yourself. Bullies, the purpose of bullying, a lot of people say,
My mom and stepdad used to lock the freezer and refrigerator door on me, and I was on their food stamps.
yeah, so
I wasn't allowed to eat anything in the house but a
there you go. And so to a little kid who's not allowed to eat food, the ultimate narrative is, well, I'm not allowed to eat food because I'm a bad person. I'm not worth the food. That's a powerful story. I know a lot of people who were told by their primary caregivers, you'll never amount to nothing. This is why I'm beating you. This is why I'm torturing you. It happens all the time. That happens enough. It doesn't take much. People come away, little people and even adults come away from that thinking, well, the world is dangerous and people are dangerous, but really, I'm just not good enough. What we do in this program, why are we talking about stories? Because they're impactful and they create belief systems based on fear and then things like anger, anxiety, and depression. What is our job in recovery? Starting now? Relax. And go forth, learn a different story, and tell a different story. One that's realistic. I don't care, well, I do care because it's impactful, but whatever people said to you or say to you, it's just not true, because things like you're a bad person, you can't prove that. Little kids, what little kid is bad? I mean, little kids are wonderful. You can create bad behaviors in little kids by traumatizing them, but the average little kid is just a wonderful little kid. And when you start telling them that they're a piece of garbage, bad things happen. And your job in early recovery is to change the narrative and start challenging all of those belief systems that are holding you back. If you believe that the United States of America is the best country in the history of mankind and that helps you, well, then cool. But if you believe that you're a bad person because you spilled milk as a kid, we need to have a talk. We need to have a conversation about that. When people, and then of course the paradox is your average abuser was abused themselves, right? So they go and abuse the next person down the line or neglect the next person down the line. Then of course they have to blame the victim or the survivor because otherwise they're the bad person. So you abuse someone and then blame it on them, and then you're off the hook. But who's on the hook? The next person, which was you. So trust me, you got to change that narrative. Why? You will never quit drugs and alcohol, and you will never practice self-care if you don't think you're worthy of it. I want to start exercising. Now, what's the point? I'm a piece of shit anyway. I want to eat better. What's the point? Nobody looks at me anyway. You know, the average obese person is a trauma survivor.
Oh yeah.
I used to watch like the 600 pounds, like my 600-pound life and stuff like that.
So
That's really traumatic.
it's going to be really hard to practice self-care if you don't practice self-love, self-compassion, self-respect. And in order to do that, you have to challenge the narrative, change the story, and come up with a new story. Connie, I can say your name on tape. You're my assistant. What's a great new narrative to come up with in early recovery? That's helpful for... So how about this one? Remember, the narrative of a lot of people coming in is, I ain't got this. I can't do this because I'm not good enough. A really good narrative in early recovery is, I got this, man. Remember we talked earlier, it's going to be okay. You know, isn't it funny that everyone's always told us that we're not good enough and that we can't change, and no wonder you're a drug addict or an alcoholic. I mean, we all knew that was going to happen, and bad things are going to, you always cause bad things. But isn't it funny how the worst case scenario has never really happened? We must not be that incompetent. You're in treatment. People are treating you like human beings in treatment. Why is that? Raise your hand if you've ever been in treatment and you felt like, this doesn't feel right because why do these people care? It's because you don't care about yourself. Treatment will only work if you come in with self-respect and self-compassion. And then paradoxically, the best way to develop that is to practice self-care. It's difficult to practice self-care when you don't care about yourself. A good way to turn that around is to just start taking care of yourself. And then because you'll be confronted with the fact that, hey, I'm brushing my teeth and I'm washing my hair and I'm wearing clean clothes. I must be worthy of it. And then that develops self-compassion and a new narrative. And then that new narrative propels self-care. And then all of a sudden we have a what? A positive cycle instead of the vicious cycle. Okay, so the story is really important. And when we're talking about psychology, it's really important because our psychology is based on storyline and narrative. And the way our brain was either designed or created or it evolved, we are absolutely hardwired to tell stories and believe stories. Could you imagine a world without television and movies? Do you think it's a coincidence that it's just so ingrained in our culture? No, you go back 5,000 years and human beings were sitting around a fire telling stories. We tell stories to explain things. We tell stories to give ourselves purpose. The problem is if the story is toxic and untrue, it is devastating.
Are books lumped in with entertainment?
Sure. No, there's absolutely stories. Okay, so and then that gives us a segue into discussing transitioning or shifting to a different conversation about how the brain's made up. We talked about psychology being thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And then we're going to talk about how the brain is actually, like the physiology or the anatomy of it. And we'll talk about how a certain part of the brain takes that narrative and storyline and runs with it because of the way that it's designed and its purpose. And then we got all kinds of trouble. And that trouble is anxiety and depression and addiction and dangerous, violent ideology, things like racism, chauvinism, xenophobia, and all the rest. So anyway, excellent conversation, and I hope it was valuable.